Should the Jets be looking to draft a tackle no matter what with the 13th overall pick? There are pros and cons. Let's talk this through on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 31st, the final day of March 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe or follow Locked On Jets for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it's available. We have not talked about much about the NFL draft here on this podcast because this offseason has been really focused on the quarterback position and over the last couple of weeks, Aaron Rodgers in particular. But we have a draft coming up in just a few weeks. The Jets own the 13th overall pick, and at this point, it seems pretty clear that any thought that the 13th overall pick was going to be part of an Aaron Rodgers trade is pretty much gone. The Jets don't want to give up the pick. It's been reported in multiple places. And within the last couple of days, even the Packers general manager has said that, he's not expecting to get a first-round pick, or at least a first-round pick this year for Aaron Rodgers. So as we wait for the Rodgers situation to resolve itself, we have a draft to look forward to. It's one of the great times of the year. So let's talk draft strategy. Now, there's a lot that goes into making a draft pick. Some people focus specifically on positional need. Some people focus specifically on best player available. Typically, a team's approach kind of depends on both. Because, teams aren't necessarily going to leap at the guy who necessarily fills the biggest need because that guy may not be that good. And you have to remember the draft is a long-term proposition. You're not just drafting a player for this year. You're trying to draft a guy who's going to be with you for 8 to 10 years. Of course, though, positional need does come into play. And especially for a team like the Jets where with Rodgers, their time frame has moved way up. Their time frame is essentially now, this year and maybe next year. So a team like the Jets needs to be a little bit more short-term focused than most of the teams in the NFL because you've got a quarterback who's 39 who's going to be turning 40 during the season. So what do the Jets need right now? Well, I think the biggest need for me is on the offensive line, and in particular, it's at the tackle position. Now, let's assume Elijah Vera Tucker is moving to guard. The Jets have kind of hinted at the idea of Vera Tucker is going to be back at guard this year. This tackle position's got some issues. Now, you could talk yourself into this tackle spot. You could talk yourself into maybe squeezing another year out of Dwayne Brown. The Jets do this a lot. They'll have some veteran player, and you think he's done, and you think they're going to address the need in the offseason, and then they end up saying, okay, this guy will give us one more year. If you were a Jets fan, 8 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago, that's what they pretty much did with Calvin Pace at outside linebacker for like 4 straight years, where you thought that they were done with Calvin Pace. You thought that they would address the edge rusher spot, the outside linebacker position, and Rex Ryan, and then Todd Bowles' defense. And then suddenly Pace is back for another year. And it seems like that could be the option with Dwayne Brown. Now, Dwayne Brown was not awful last year, but he's a guy late 30s on the offensive line. It's one thing to have a quarterback at 39. It's another thing to have an offensive lineman, a position that's very physically demanding, a position where Dwayne Brown, a guy who's been pretty durable through his career, was playing hurt the whole year and missed a couple games at the start of the season. And a guy who was, clearly in decline, a guy who was, I don't think, a weakness, a guy who kind of helped to stabilize the Jets' offensive line to an extent after Mekhi Becton's injury, but still a guy who, clearly on the downside of his career. I'm not sure he's got much good football left in him. The Jets seem to think he does, but I don't know about that. On the other side, I guess right now you'd have to say Mekhi Becton is the guy who's penciled in to be the starting right tackle. That's not a great idea. Now, here's what I'll say. So I know somebody's going to say, well, Becton could stay healthy next year. And of course that's possible. I'm not saying it's a foregone conclusion that Becton's going to be injured in 2023. But what I would say is, do you feel comfortable placing all of your eggs in the basket that Mekhi Becton's going to stay healthy? It's one thing to say it could happen. It's another thing to say we are depending on this to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then we got problems. Now, you could also argue that the guy behind Mekhi Becton is Max Mitchell, a guy with some perhaps untapped potential, a guy who got some starting experience this year, because the Jets had so many injuries at the tackle position. And sometimes what happens is when a rookie is pressed into the lineup too soon because of injuries, it hurts you in the short run. But in the long run, the player's better for it. This was supposed to be a developmental year for Max Mitchell in 2022. He clearly was not physically ready. He kind of got pushed around when he started at right tackle early in the season. Fourth round pick, a rookie who was really supposed to spend the year developing, hitting in the weight room, developing some upper body strength. Again, is it possible Max Mitchell steps into the lineup and plays well? Yes. The question is whether it's not a question of whether it's possible. It's a question of whether you want to count on that, whether that's going to be the thing that determines whether your position's a success or not. Now, you have 3 wild cards. Conceivably, any of them could go right. Brown giving you another year, Becton staying healthy, Mitchell developing. You could talk yourself into it. Do you really think 2 of those 3 is going to happen, though? Again, it's possible, but I don't like betting everything on that position. And the other aspect of this is, again, you've got a quarterback who's approaching 40. So you got to put a good line in front of him. Aaron Rodgers, for much of his career, has had, for my money, the guy who, for a long stretch, was the best, and I'm not saying one of the best. I'm going to say he was the best left tackle in the league in David Bakhtiari. Guy who, I would have loved to have been on the Jets. So you got to put, and Rodgers' mobility is declined. I don't think there's any question about that. When we're talking about whether Aaron Rodgers has declined, maybe not to the point where he's an ineffective quarterback. He still could be a top quarterback. He's still going to be probably one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL because I think the arm's still there and the decision-making is still there. The ability to place the ball where it needs to go is still there. But the mobility, that fed a lot of Rodgers' playmaking. That took Rodgers from being a very good quarterback to being a great quarterback. And that's gone. So that means in order to get peak Rodgers, you've got to protect him. And this tackle spot, I don't know. I think that's a little shaky. Again, it's good enough that there's enough there that you can talk yourself into it. But talking myself into it is different from being confident. And I think that's one of the things you forget in the offseason, because I think everybody tries to look to the season with an optimistic viewpoint, and that's right. That's a good thing to do. You're a good fan if you do that. You're trying to. Nobody wants to be negative in the offseason. I try and be realistic. I try not to be negative. But most people want to be positive in the offseason, so it's fine. You're a good fan if you're looking forward and saying this could all work out. You're supposed to talk yourself into it in the offseason. But you're asking a lot. It's one thing to say it could work out. It's another to say I'm depending on it. And for the Jets, it's interesting because views tend to be all over the place about where some of these tackles are going to go. there are some names you hear, and we'll probably talk about these players in more detail in the weeks leading up to the draft. You got Paris Campbell out of Ohio. Paris Johnson out of Ohio State. Paris Campbell was a different Ohio State player from a few years ago. Getting my Paris's from Ohio State mixed up. You've a guy I've seen recently, Anton Harrison out of Oklahoma. Another guy, Broderick Jones out of Georgia. And again, some of these players have very wide ranges on where they could be selected. There's some other guys who could be in the mix. We'll probably talk about them in the weeks ahead. But the Jets, at 13, that's kind of the sweet spot to get one of these guys. Now, of course, they have to be good. You may remember back in 2020, there were 4 big tackles. And the Jets, I think, were at 11 that year. They ended up with Mekhi Becton, and that really has not worked out for them. So there's more that goes into it than that. But, should the Jets be looking at drafting a tackle no matter what? Well, I hate going into the draft needing a position, needing to draft a player at a certain position. But sometimes that's the spot you're in. That's the spot the Jets were in last year at the wide receivers position. They had to draft somebody at 10. It was a conclusion. You knew going in they were drafting a receiver at 10. You did not know which one it would be, in part because you had no idea who would fall to 10. If Drake London was there at 10, would the Jets have drafted him over Garrett Wilson? We'll never know. I thought at the time they would have. I don't know. Maybe they wouldn't have. Garrett Wilson, well, no matter what, it worked out for the Jets. So I'm not saying it can't work out. But I do think it's a tough spot because for the right player to match your spot, it's tough enough. It's tough enough to find a guy when you have every position at your disposal. When you're narrowing it down to one position, it's tough. But sometimes you have to do it. And for the Jets, maybe that's what they have to do. But there are other options. And as we continue on this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about them. Could the Jets kind of turn convention away? And could they try and draft a playmaker to help Aaron Rodgers out? I'll tell you what I have in mind as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. It's been quite a March Madness, and not just for basketball. We have Built March Madness. The bracket is here. We know you have a favorite bar or puff, and now it's time to make it count. So go to BuiltMarchMadness.com to vote for your favorites. Support your team in March Madness, the Final Fours this weekend, and support your favorite bar or puff. And when you vote for your favorite bar or puff, you will be entered into a drawing where 50 lucky Locked On listeners will get a free box. Not only that, but one lucky Locked On fan will get a 12-month subscription to Built to have Built's best bars or puff delivered monthly straight to your door. You've got to try Built. Built is the best protein bar ever. They are so amazing that you will not think they're good for you. What makes them so good? Well, for starters, they're all high in protein, low in sugar, and covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. So go ahead and pick up a box today. Go to BuiltMarchMadness.com. Vote for your favorite bar or puff. You can vote every day in March, so hop in and support your pick. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. We're talking Jets draft strategies today. Left tackle or maybe right tackle. One of the tackle spots is a big need for the Jets this year, unless you want to depend on Dwayne Brown, Mekhi Becton, Max Mitchell. A trio where you could talk yourself into it, but talking yourself into it, again, is very different from being confident. Could the Jets go in a different direction, though? Could they try and add a playmaker? And I have somebody in mind who, you may not be thinking of. It's not a great year for receivers. We've had a number of really good receiver draft classes in 2020. That's one that comes to mind. Unfortunately, the Jets ended up with Denzel Mims in that one. I was very excited at the time to get Denzel Mims, but that really has not worked out. 2021, another really good class, Elijah Moore. Once again, I was very excited. Once again, did not work out. Last year was actually viewed as a relatively weak class at the beginning. Then it felt like as we got closer, people bought in more and more. Jets, of course, got Garrett Wilson. Hey, that one worked out really well. That one out of three. At least one of these three panned out. At least one of these three we're really happy with. Now this year, there's some guys you could look at early. Jackson Smith and Jigba out of Ohio State as a receiver, but this is actually not a great draft class overall. This looks like maybe it's something with the years that end in 3. This on paper looks like the worst draft class since 2013, and that was a year where the Jets ironically drafted Sheldon Richardson, who ended up being the rookie of the year on the defensive side of the ball. But there were some bad picks in there. You had D. Milner. You had some guys who had moderate success in the NFL. Geno Smith, not so much in New York, but now has turned into a good quarterback with Seattle. You had Brian Winters in the third round, who actually for a third-round pick, as critical as I was of Winters, wasn't that bad. For a third-round pick, was probably better than what you typically get in the third round. But the problem was they drafted him over Keenan Allen at a time where the Jets really needed wide receivers. So, that actually was not. You look back on it, you have these negative memories of the 2013 draft class for the Jets, but in an awful year, I think John Nidzik's draft class actually wasn't that terrible. But there also were not a ton of great players in that class. And this year, I don't think there are a ton of great players. And while I think positional value has to come into play at some point, you also need to draft impact. So, a guy I have in mind at 13, who I don't know if the Jets would do this, Bijan Robinson, the running back out of Texas, a dynamic running back. And I am actually of the mindset, and you probably know this, that most running backs are interchangeable. You can find a good running back practically anywhere. And then maybe that's overstating it, but running backs typically depend more on their offensive line than they depend on their own abilities. And I think that the things that set apart a great running back are breakaway ability, maybe to an extent what they can provide in the receiving game. And, we saw that a little bit last year with Breece Hall. Breece Hall looked really special in the time, he was before he got injured for the Jets. He may have run away with the Rookie of the Year. The Jets may have had, if Breece Hall had not gotten injured, the Jets still probably would have had a Rookie of the Year, but it may have been Breece instead of Garrett Wilson. Now, running back in the NFL, it's not a valuable position because most guys are interchangeable, but we got Breece coming back from an injury. And, I think at some point Breece is probably going to get back to being Breece. He may not be the same guy early in the season, though. It may take him some time to get back to 100%. And as great as Breece was, how about a second back who could make a difference? And again, I may not be advocating for this in a normal year because, and I know that this is going to be controversial because the Jets just drafted a very special running back a year ago, but I don't, sometimes I think it helps us to get away from positions, to just think about roles. You need a playmaker. You need as many playmakers as you can. I know it was different positions, but the Kansas City Chiefs, and again, I'm saying get away from positions. The Chiefs never stopped adding playmakers around Patrick Mahomes. Now they added pass catchers more than running backs, but there are different ways to do things in the NFL. And in a class that does not have a ton of top end talent, let me ask you this: would it be that crazy if there's another special running back for the Jets to draft him? And then you've got a 1-2 punch out of the backfield. It's a different way of team building. It's an unconventional approach, especially in today's NFL. But again, part of what plays into this is the draft class, because your odds of finding a special player in this year's class are just not that great. And as I said in the first segment, there are arguments to be made for focusing on the offensive line, in part because the Jets really need to build a line in front of their 39, soon to be 40-year-old quarterback. But if you could add another back, another playmaker, and by the way, that's something that could take pressure off Aaron Rodgers. I think because there are so few great backs in the NFL, maybe we've lost track of what a great back can do for your offense, how a great back can take pressure off your quarterback. That stretch where Breece Hall was playing great, the Jets won games, even though they were not getting a whole lot from Zach Wilson. In fact, in the 3 games, Breece Hall really stepped up. That was the home win over Miami, the road win over Green Bay, and the road win against Denver, where Breece got injured, and unfortunately Elijah Vera Tucker also got injured in that game. The only one of those 3 where Zach Wilson threw for more than 125 yards was the game against Miami. And in that game, he threw for about 200, and Breece provided almost 100 of those receiving yards through his playmaking ability. So, it is a passing league. You need a quarterback, but sometimes a great back, and there aren't many great backs in the NFL, but sometimes a great back can help lift up a quarterback, especially when that position's shaky. And the position will not be shaky if Aaron Rodgers is around. So I think a great back could take some of the pressure off him. And as Aaron Rodgers ages, you don't want him carrying as much of the load, because he can't. As every player eventually gets old, they can't do as much. Aaron Rodgers still should be playing at a pretty high level for the Jets, but I don't know if you can count on him to be vintage Aaron Rodgers. You can count on him to be a very good quarterback, and if you have a couple of running backs who can take the pressure off him, suddenly that makes a difference. Suddenly maybe he can give you enough to make a run, and beyond that, maybe it takes some of the pressure off the offensive line. Sometimes you can't fix a problem. Sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to make another position so strong that the problem just doesn't matter. The Jets had a revolving door on the offensive line last season. It did not matter so much when Breece Hall was running away with the Rookie of the Year award before he got injured. So it's an unconventional approach, and I think it would get some criticism drafting another running back high this year. And normally I'd be against it, but you look at the options. I don't know that there are a lot of great alternatives for the Jets, so I think it's actually something I would consider. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our Friday show. I'll give you one final thought about how the Jets could approach this 13th overall pick, and you'll hear it ahead on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The draft is approaching, but we're still a couple months away from real NFL games. However, as you know, this weekend is the Final Four. We've got 2 schools from South Florida. We've got UConn. We've got San Diego State. The tournament's heating up. The Final Four is here. And there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up today and claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the nets. And it's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about the upcoming NFL draft. Really, this offseason has been so focused on the quarterback position and Aaron Rodgers, we have not had much time to talk about the draft. But it's coming up in just a few weeks. Jets hopefully will add some good young players. As I said, though, this is not projected to be a great draft class. And in that sense, maybe it makes sense to just ignore positional value and just go for the best player. Go with a pure best player available approach. And I talked a little bit about that in the last segment where I suggested maybe the Jets could go with a running back for a second straight year in the early rounds. I always say this, the draft should be viewed as a long-term proposition. You never look back and remember what your team's needs were in a given year. It seems like all of our focus when we enter the draft season is what are our immediate needs. Yet you never judge a pick on that in the long run. What you judge is how good the player was. Do you remember what the Jets' needs were in 2013? Do you remember what the Jets' needs were in 2016? No, you remember the players they drafted. You remember Dean Milner was a complete bust. Do you remember whether the Jets needed a quarterback? Well, maybe you do because it was right after they traded Darrelle Revis, but they also had Antonio Cromartie at that point. Do you remember in 2016 whether the Jets needed a linebacker? You probably don't. You just remember Darren Lee was a bad pick. So you don't judge these. It's kind of weird because I don't think we ever actually think this stuff through. We never think through how do we judge picks in the long run. Instead, we keep going with this grading system that's so based on positional need, and we never consider that we don't look back on these picks and judge them on whether the team needed a player at a certain position at that point in time. It's just not something we do, at least to evaluate whether a player is good or not. Now, sometimes we look back in retrospect and we say, wow, we should have drafted that player. But again, you don't remember from year to year what needs your position have, what positional needs you have. And beyond that, I mean, the whole point of the draft is not necessarily to fix your needs immediately. It's more about preventing a need from emerging. If you draft, like the Jets drafted Sauce Gardner last year. Now for the next 8 years, I don't think you're going to look back and say corner's a need. Garrett Wilson, the Jets drafted him last year. Receiver, you could say after Garrett Wilson's receiver's a need, but they have a go-to guy now. They're not lacking a go-to guy on offense, so receiver's less pronounced of a need. So in some ways, it's kind of like a negative. It's kind of like the reverse of what we're saying. It's not so much about filling your needs. It's about preventing needs from emerging. And that's kind of the approach you take when you focus on drafting the best player. And beyond that, the Jets are obviously very short-term focused right now. Maybe the draft can help balance that out a little bit, because after Aaron Rodgers leaves, Jets are probably going to have a tighter cap situation because of all the money they're pushing to the future. So if you're focused on drafting an impact player, that can help soften the blow, because as Aaron Rodgers retires, that player will be in year 2, year 3, year 4, and really emerging if he's a great player, and maybe it will help the Jets stabilize after Rodgers leaves and their cap situation tightens quite a bit. So, I think the one position you could rule out is corner. But any other spot on the field, can you really say the Jets would turn down an upgrade? Can you say that the Jets are set for the next 3 years at any position other than corner? If the answer to that is no, then I don't think you should necessarily focus on any given position. And maybe I've answered my question, because I began this show asking, should the Jets be focused on a tackle at 13? And I said I did not know. And through the course of the show, I think I've kind of convinced myself that maybe tackle at 13 should not be a given. Maybe the Jets should just focus on finding the best player possible. Then maybe this is not one of those years where they have to draft a player at a given position, that position being tackle. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.